Hey everyone, it's Professor Snart. One last check-in here as we wind up our creative writing course. So I thought I'd do a more FaceTime type of thing instead of a screenshot, since you probably have a fairly good idea of how the course is laid out and working so far. Okay, so I'm recording this. We're right kind of in the middle of our final workshop, our poetry workshop. Today, Wednesday, is the posting date, and then of course we'll turn around for the feedback date. Do your best with the feedback. I know it's challenging anyways to feel sort of like that you have a good enough relationship with the people whose writing you're reading, and the confidence enough to maybe make suggestions or kind of note where things aren't as successful as they could be, but do your best. And I think with poetry it's even more challenging because oftentimes there's not even like a kind of traditional story to hang your hat on, where you can say, well, this plot device is confusing, or there's often not really definable characters. Sometimes there should be more definable characters. And so sometimes just, finding something to grasp onto in a poem can be a little bit challenging. And in fact, that's something to think about as you're reading people's poetry, is that if there's no sort of like tangible thing, there's no place or setting or really kind of like characters that you can see or understand, that might be a bit of a deficiency. Oftentimes, again, I've mentioned before that there's a lot of baggage that comes along with poetry, and I think one of the things is that people tend to think that the more ambiguous a poem is, the better it is, but there's a big difference between kind of ambiguous or multiple meanings and just not being clear, or lack of clarity, or lack of precision, we might say. One of the other ironic rules of creative writing we've looked at is that oftentimes to be the most accessible, or to speak to a wider audience, instead of being more general, we actually want to be more specific. So we're naming characters, we're defining setting very clearly. It's not just sort of like this amorphous, philosophy floating out in space there. So the thing that makes poetry challenging to comment on sometimes is that it is often kind of more philosophical than narrative, if we want to say that. But that might precisely be one of the things that you might want to mention. In other words, just because you don't get it doesn't mean the poem is successfully ambiguous. It means it's unsuccessfully ambiguous. So do your best with the poetry, even though I know it's a little bit more challenging than some of the other genres that we've tackled. So then we complete our final unit, which is a reflection essay. You'll see that there's an option to do a video in there, which is, I think, a really great way to kind of wrap up the course. The reflection essay is the pretty traditional, like, what did you learn in this class sort of thing, which is both hard to answer, but I think really important that we do take that moment to reflect on the territory that we've covered. 5 weeks goes fast, but we've actually done a lot of stuff. And if you look back at the writing we've done, we've covered a lot of genres. We've talked a little bit about sort of what makes that genre different from others, but also how they're linked together. In terms of certain aspects of craft, like characters important, plot can be important, word choice is important, sort of across genres. That's not particular to one, but not another one. And even some of the writing exercises we've done, they all really are designed to point to aspects of craft, whether it's concision, so we have to write in a certain number of words, like a limited number of words. We have to create an interesting backstory, for example. Sometimes we're just listening to or watching other writers talk about their own writing and the craft of writing. And it's all sort of pointing towards you being able to think about what your strengths are, what your areas for improvement might be, but also kind of like how writers, no matter what the genre or what the literary sort of context that they're writing in, famous or not so famous, they all sort of, or we all sort of face the same writing challenges. Like, we want to create great characters that people care about, but how do you do that? That's not a challenge just for someone who's writing their first short story. That's a challenge for the most famous novelist you could name, right? They have to create interesting characters too. So they might have had more practice at it, but it's still actually the same fundamental challenge or problem that they're facing. And so that's what I'd like to get us to as we wrap up our course. So you're reflecting in your last essay on your work for the course and what you learned. Even though, like I've said before, in a creative writing setting, regardless of the term length, even in the 16-week term, that like a lot of months kind of working on something. But truthfully, you know, the craft of writing, it emerges so slowly. Sometimes that's the frustrating part. It's like you don't necessarily always see it in yourself. If you just looked at work from 2 weeks ago, you wouldn't be like, oh my gosh, I was so young and foolish then. And even if it was 2 months ago, you know, you don't have that perspective necessarily. 2 years, that could be a different story. But it's still important to reflect on the things that we've done, sort of consolidate some of the ideas about writing so you can now really think of yourself as a writer. Because you write, maybe you don't want to publish, that's sort of beside the point, but you care about the craft of writing. And so you are now kind of within that group of people, famous and emergent and all that, everywhere in between, who are now having to deal and have dealt with those fundamental challenges of how do you tell a good story? How do you make something interesting to somebody who doesn't know you and doesn't really care about you? And I don't mean that in any negative sense, but they're not like emotionally attached to you, so they have to become emotionally attached to the story that you tell or the characters that you develop. And again, I think a lot of people, they're a little bit nervous about that, so they write about very dramatic, traumatic things, whether it's big sort of life-changing events, or in the realm of fiction, people start inventing like zombies and whatever kind of fantastical things, because they don't necessarily trust themselves to tell a good story. So what you might find is that some of the best writing is really evocative and impactful, but it's precisely not about these massive things. So there's lots of seemingly mundane kind of events that are going on, and if you can get interested in that story, then the writer has really done a pretty incredible job. One of the funny things, and this goes for so many different aspects of life, whether it's like sports or music or writing, of course, is that sometimes you pick up a novel and you just start reading it, and it's like page after page, and it's really good, and you're like, all you have to do is just keep on typing, and there's your novel. Like, how hard could that be? And then you sit down to do it, and it's like, damn, this is impossible. And then you walk in the bookstore, and it's like, holy cow, so many people have done this. Or, you know, the sports metaphor. You go and see a professional athlete, and they make the thing that's really, really hard look easy because of all the time that he or she is invested in just getting that good. Musician, right? They make it look easy, but then you go and if you actually pick up that instrument, that guitar or violin or whatever it is, piano, oh God, it's like, holy, are they from a different planet? Like, how did they do that? And so, again, the idea for the reflection essay isn't to definitively say, I used to be at this level of writing and now I'm at this level of writing, because it unfolds so slowly. And sometimes it's really hard to see from the outside that sort of development, I guess you could say. Again, you know, so it's somewhat artificial. I hate to say that because it sort of poisons the whole thing. But I do want you to attend to like ways in which you think you might be improving. Maybe that's a good way to put it. So you're kind of mapping a trajectory moving forward, rather than this being totally just looking backwards and like, oh, on May 23rd, I became a better writer or whatever, you know, kind of strange thing you could say. Oh, the other thing, though, is that despite the fact that those kind of specifics are really hard to pin down, that's kind of what I'm admitting here, is that I do, though, want you to really be specific about things that you've done in the class. You're almost going to quote from your own work. And it doesn't have to just be the workshops. It can be some of the more informal writing exercises or just anything that we've done throughout the various units we've done in the course. So, long story short, it's the final reflection essay, which I hope people will do as a video because it's just sort of nice to like see people one last time, is that on one level, it's really kind of amorphous because the craft of writing unfolds so slowly, and sometimes doing it really well appears really easy, and it's hard to pinpoint like what makes that so good and yet appear so kind of seamless or easy. But, so that's the amorphous part. But despite that, I still want as much as you can for your final reflection to be grounded in the specifics of things that you've done for the course, whether it's workshop, informal writing exercises, responses to other things that we've looked at or read in the course. So try to really ground it in specifics, even if what you're saying is just kind of like your arc on this very incremental path. And of course, we don't always just improve as writers. We often go through these like little sort of troughs and valleys or whatever, where we know we should be getting better, and yet we've just written something that you look at and you're like, oh my God, that's terrible. So not everything is always better than the last thing. Okay, so anyway, I hope you enjoyed the course, even though it's very fast to get into something like creative writing. I hope you're proud of the work that you've done, even if you don't think it's still in its finished, polished, most perfect form. I hope that you will keep writing. I hope you'll take more creative writing classes at COD. We have a whole range of different classes that are focused on genres. So you do a full class on poetry, that's me, short fiction, creative nonfiction with Tom Fate, whose work that we read in the class. So there's lots more options out there. And that I hope some of you, maybe all of you, will work towards publishing. Maybe you're already publishing, but to set that as your goal, it obviously helps, like due dates in a course. It helps to have a goal with your writing. Otherwise, you kind of, for me anyway, it just sort of fizzles, right? You get excited, but there's no end in sight. So it is half done and just sort of sits there. Okay, again, one last mention that if you wanted further feedback on any of the writing that you've done throughout the course, just get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to talk with you about it. And again, I hope you enjoyed the course. If you do have any further questions or things are unclear as we wrap up, by all means be in touch with me. But hopefully I will have the pleasure of meeting some of you again in a future creative writing course.